On my 30th birthday, I was expecting the state to assign me a delicate, petite Omega white. I couldn't keep the smile off my face. But when that door pushed open, I froze. Standing there was a man pushing 6'3". His broad shoulders formed an insurmountable fortress of muscle, radiating the arrogant, inescapable magnetism of an apex predator. This wasn't a soft, sweet Omega wife. This was a top-tier Enigma, the kind who could consume an alpha body and soul. Midnight. The fluorescent lights of the CBD office towers flickered out one by one. Samuel, a bottom-tier alpha who had just turned 30, sat on the edge of the shadows, his fingertips mechanically striking the keyboard. Beside him lay a stack of reports dumped by a colleague and a cheap melting butter cake. The weak candlelight illuminated the heavy dark circles under his eyes and his gentle, utterly harmless face. In a society that worshipped absolute power, a mild, mannered alpha like him didn't even qualify for a second glance from an Omega. The moment he blew out the candle, the cold glow of his phone screen illuminated the dark. The state marriage system had issued an inescapable mandate. Match. Robert Hohenheim pheromone compatibility, 98%. Samuel's knuckles instantly turned stark white as he gripped the phone. Hohenheim? The top-tier aristocrat who held the empire in the palm of his hand? Before his calloused thumb could even hover over the cancel button, a flurry of pink, emoticon-filled speech bubbles popped up on the screen. The tone was vibrant and joyful. Samuel's stiff spine relaxed a fraction, his mind automatically sketching the image of a soft petite Omega, eager to meet him. The next evening, at a cheap chain restaurant, the warm yellow spotlights hit Samuel as he tugged at his discounted necktie for the third time, suffocating under the cheap fabric. The coarse material of his suit jacket rubbed against the vulnerable scent gland at the nape of his neck, leaving the skin raw and irritated. He stared at the swaying ice in his lemon water, his peripheral vision dead, locked on the restaurant's entrance. 6:59 p.m. Ding. The brass bell above the door let out a crisp chime. Samuel stood up, a nervous, polite smile on his lips. But the moment his eyes focused on the arrival, that smile froze into glacial terror. At the edge of his vision, the light at the entrance seemed to be instantly swallowed by a black hole. A figure of pure, irresistible domination entirely blocked the doorframe. The man was nearly 6'7", his broad chest and back forming an unscalable iron wall. Dazzling blonde hair was casually tied back, framing a jawline as sharp and cold as carved marble. Those deep blue eyes, like the eye of a torrential storm, carried the arrogant disdain of a top-tier predator. His gaze, heavy with a magnetic, inescapable pull, pinned Samuel right where he stood. With the heavy, muffled thud of leather shoes stepping onto the floorboards, the oxygen in the restaurant was instantly compressed. From the void, a visible tide of dark blue shadow flooded the dining room. The overhead lights buzzed under the unbearable strain, the glow violently warped into a dark, freezing ocean blue. The air humidity spiked to a critical threshold. Heavy beads of condensation rapidly formed on the glass tumblers, and even the dust suspended in the air seemed to plummet under the crushing gravity. All around them, the spines of the other diners hunched over involuntarily. The clattering of dropped silverware echoed in waves. The alphas went paper white, their legs trembling uncontrollably, while the Omegas went utterly limp, a feverish flush creeping up their necks as they desperately covered their glands. Samuel? The man's voice was as rich and low as the bass string of a cello. It carried a physical, resonant vibration that detonated straight through Samuel's chest. This was no delicate Omega. This was an abyss that reigned supreme over all genders. A top-tier monster so rare you could count them on one hand, an Enigma. Samuel's Adam's apple bobbed with immense difficulty. Under the absolute biological supremacy of that aura, his legs completely gave out, and he crashed heavily back into his chair. His fingertips clawed into the coarse tablecloth, the nail beds turning a horrifying, ghostly white from the exertion. Cold sweat beaded at his temples, tracing the lines of his pale cheeks, before dripping onto the back of his trembling hand. Robert took the seat opposite him. His massive frame instantly reduced the cheap restaurant booth into a suffocating, inescapable cage. I suppose the system didn't tell you my gender. The man tilted his head slightly. It should have been a casual gesture, but it caused the deep sea shadows surrounding Samuel to violently constrict, making his bones let out a faint, protesting ache. I suppose you were hoping for an Omega? Robert looked at Samuel, an unfathomable undercurrent surging in the depths of his eyes. Samuel trembled slightly. 30 years of humble savings, a cheap suit, and sweet fantasies of a petite partner were entirely pulverized to dust before this absolute power. I thought. His voice was as hoarse as if it had been ground down by coarse sandpaper. In that very split second, the suffocating deep sea pressure completely vanished. Robert, who just a moment ago had looked down on him like a ruthless deity, suddenly lowered his sharp gaze in grievance. His broad shoulders hunched inward slightly, and a fragile misty wetness rapidly flooded his deep blue eyes. His high nose bridge cast a lonely shadow beneath his eyelids. The tight, harsh line of his jaw relaxed, and the corners of his lips curved into an incredibly bleak, almost beautifully shattered smile. I knew it. He lowered his long eyelashes in self-deprecation, the golden strands brushing against his pale cheek. Every alpha has this exact reaction when they see who I really am. Samuel, if you want to cancel the match, I understand. With the shift in his tone, the bone-crushing dark blue shadows receded as quickly as the tide. The restaurant's warped, dim lighting warmed up once more, returning to a soft amber that chased away the suffocating heavy moisture in the air. 1 second, he was a leviathan, capable of crushing everything in its path. The next, he was like a massive, abandoned hound, carefully tucking away its claws. This extreme visual and psychological whiplash made Samuel's heart violently skip a beat. His fingers, which had instinctively recoiled to the edge of the table, paused. They curled stiffly in mid-air. No, I'm not. He swallowed hard. Just a little surprised. Robert's eyes snapped up, a scorching brightness erupting in his blue irises. There was even a faint, pitiful flush at the corners of his eyes. Then, are you still willing to go on this date with me? The distance closed. Samuel could even see the minute, trembling shadows that the man's long eyelashes cast against his cool, pale skin. Yes. Samuel heard his own parched voice ring out in the space. Robert smiled. The gloom between his brows was swept completely clean, and even the ambient temperature seemed to rise a few degrees. He gracefully flipped open the menu, his large, elegant hands forming a stark contrast with the cheap plastic. With a light tap of his fingertip, he smoothly summoned the waiter. Crimson wine was poured into the goblets, refracting a lush, ruby-red luminescence. Gripping a silver knife and fork, Robert sliced into a perfectly seared, ruby-centered steak. His movements were as elegant and unhurried as a medieval ritual of devotion. So, Samuel, what do you do for a living? Under Robert's deliberately lowered posture and softening gaze, the tense air finally slackened. Samuel's stiff fingers, gripping his own cutlery, began to sweat and slip. He looked down at his clumsy way of cutting the meat, then back up at those sculpted, art-like hands across the table. A deep sense of inferiority crawled up his spine like an inescapable shadow. I work in finance at a trading company. Just a regular clerk. Finance requires an incredible amount of patience and meticulous attention to detail. That's impressive. Robert set down his knife and fork, leaning in slightly. Those blue eyes locked onto Samuel with absolute sincerity. I could never. Just looking at numbers gives me a headache. The rich aroma of the wine bloomed on his tongue, masking the lingering aftertaste of fear. Robert steered the conversation with masterful skill. He watched Samuel's every micro-expression. His perfectly timed chuckles and devoted listening gradually loosened Samuel's tight jawline, coaxing a shy, genuine smile to his lips. Under the warm amber halo, cutlery clinked. For a few fleeting moments, Samuel fell under a fatal illusion, as if the man sitting across from him truly was just a charming, captivating, ordinary partner who got headaches from doing math. Until, actually, this is my second time being matched by the system. The warm yellow light was sliced into fragmented specks by the silver cutlery. Robert absent-mindedly swirled the glass of wine, a vintage worth 3 months of Samuel's salary. His profound blue eyes watched the rich ruby liquid cling lazily to the glass in a thick, slow descent. Samuel stopped his movements. And the first time, also an alpha. A bitter, self-deprecating smile played at the corner of Robert's mouth. His broad shoulders gave a slight, fragile shudder in the dim light. The second he saw my profile, he canceled the match on the spot. Robert looked up. Those deeply invasive, predatory eyes were now brimming with a vulnerable liquid heat. You know how it is. The ego of most alphas simply cannot handle the possibility of being claimed and marked by an enigma. Clang, the silver fork crashed onto the white porcelain plate, letting out a sharp, piercing cry. Claimed by an enigma. Those few words hit Samuel's scent gland like a barbed weight. It meant an alpha would be entirely surrendered to domination, his social standing and biological instincts irrevocably rewritten. So this time, I hid my gender. Robert's voice dropped low, taking on an almost pleading vulnerability. He lowered those strikingly long golden lashes, casting a shadow of heartbreaking fragility against his cool, pale skin. I thought, if we could just meet first. If you truly couldn't accept it, then... Samuel's fingers unconsciously gripped the fabric of his cheap dress pants. He stared at the massive apex predator sitting across from him, a man who could effortlessly crush him, now looking like nothing more than a giant hound abandoned in the pouring rain, letting out a soft whimper. I have no intention of canceling the match. The moment the words left his mouth, even Samuel found them utterly absurd. Robert's head snapped up. An unbelievable brilliance erupted in those ocean blue eyes. Truly? Yeah. Samuel swallowed hard, forcefully suppressing the terrifying sharp ache spasming in his scent gland. We can. See how things go. Dinner ended in a bizarre, surreal harmony. Stepping out of the budget restaurant, the chill of the late-night wind scattered the feverish heat from Samuel's face. Robert insisted on walking him to the subway station. As they strolled side by side down the street, Robert's 6'7" frame loomed like a walking monolith, enveloping Samuel entirely in his shadow. The moonlight washed over the Enigma's sculpted profile. His high nose bridge and sharp jawline were beautiful with an irresistible magnetism. We're here. The dim entrance of the subway station looked like the gaping maw of some subterranean beast. Samuel stopped in his tracks. Thank you for tonight, Samuel. Robert turned suddenly. Those deep blue eyes instantly locked onto their mark. Standing mere inches away, Samuel could even catch the spine, tingling deep sea aura fiercely suppressed beneath the man's cologne. Thank you for giving me this chance. The man's voice was incredibly soft, laced with a faint, imperceptible huskiness. The next second, without warning, a highly concentrated, suffocating wave of oceanic pheromones crashed over him like a violent tsunami, heavy with inescapable domination. The oxygen in the air was instantly vacuumed away. The halo of the streetlights flickered violently. An irresistible weakness swept through Samuel's knees, and the gland at the back of his neck felt as though it were being seared by white-hot heat. His pulse rushed wildly. The sheer, overpowering domination over his alpha instincts left him shuddering, gasping for air as his vision darkened at the edges. Just as he was on the verge of losing consciousness, that terrifying magnetic pressure receded like the tide. Samuel raised his head, drenched in cold sweat. In the split second his vision cleared. He caught a fleeting glimpse of dark amusement swimming in the depths of Robert's eyes. But it was so fast it felt like a hallucination. In the blink of an eye, the man had reverted to that gentle, almost panicked expression. I'm sorry. Sometimes I can't control it. Robert reached out with those large, elegantly jointed hands, pulling Samuel up from the ground without leaving room for argument. His scalding palms held Samuel's trembling shoulders in an unyielding grip. Do you want me to take you home? No need. Samuel gritted his teeth, suppressing his terror as he abruptly tore himself away from those confining hands. I have work tomorrow. I should go. He stumbled into the subway station, a chilling shiver racing down his spine. That deep blue gaze clung fiercely to the back of his neck like a slick viper. The subway window reflected Samuel's paper, white face. With a trembling hand, he reached back to touch his searing, fiercely pulsing scent gland. His phone suddenly buzzed. A message from Robert. I had a great time tonight. Let me plan our next date, okay? The cute emoticon was like a piece of sugar, coated venom. Samuel stiffly typed out a brief reply, his mind completely blank. 2 weeks later. The blistering midday sun baked the asphalt until the air rippled. Samuel stood in the cool shade of his office building, irritably tugging at his old dress shirt with its yellowing collar and frayed cuffs. Over the past 14 days, Robert and his emoticon, laced texts, had turned his world completely upside down. A top-tier luxury sedan, elegant as a Black Panther, glided silently to a halt by the curb. The door opened. Robert stepped out from the air-conditioned interior, his long legs hitting the pavement. The collar of his white shirt was casually undone, his blonde hair catching the blinding sunlight. "Have you been waiting long?" Robert approached with a smile. As he drew closer, the humidity in the air eerily spiked once again. Samuel instinctively took a half-step back, his scent gland throbbing in a conditioned reflex. Robert seemed to notice. In an instant, that suffocating, deep-sea aura vanished without a trace. "Get in. The reservation is set." The sky-high restaurant. The brilliance of the crystal chandeliers stung Samuel's eyes. A manager in a tailcoat personally led the way, his judging gaze scraping across Samuel's yellowed collar like a blade. The menu was entirely in incomprehensible French, with absolutely no prices listed. Samuel's fingers gripped the pristine, high-end linen napkin so tightly, he was practically clawing a hole through it. Robert fluently rattled off a string of dishes, his fingertips lightly tapping the table. "Samuel, are you worried about the bill? It's my treat today. Consider it a celebration of our 2-week anniversary." The food was as exquisite as fine art. Samuel carefully sliced his steak, terrified of letting his silver cutlery make even a single harsh scrape against the bone china. "Try this." Robert carved off a piece of perfectly rare, top-tier Wagyu. The silver fork crossed halfway over the table, pressing against Samuel's lips with a heavy, dark intensity. The texture is quite unique. Samuel's breath hitched instantly. The probing, assessing gazes of the surrounding diners fell upon them like synchronized spotlights. Refusing this unimaginably powerful enigma was clearly an unwise move. Samuel leaned forward stiffly, parting his trembling lips to accept the cut of beef. Robert's blue eyes flared brightly, a flash of pure, intoxicating pleasure sweeping through their depths. When the check arrived, a black card symbolizing absolute power was handed over. Samuel caught a glimpse of the total. It was his entire food budget for a year. "You really didn't have to bring me somewhere this upscale." Stepping out of the heavily air-conditioned skyscraper, Samuel checked his watch. "I usually just eat at the company cafeteria or grab a rice ball from the convenience store. It's almost 1 o'clock. I need to take the subway back." "The subway?" Robert arched one sharp eyebrow. "Yeah, it's just 3 stops. Do you want to try it?" 5 minutes later, inside the cramped, noisy subway car, thick with the smell of sweat and cheap pheromones, Robert's 6'7" frame was forced to awkwardly hunch over, looking entirely out of place among the sea of exhausted commuters. His mere presence dropped the atmospheric pressure in the cabin to freezing point. Even though he tried his hardest to pull his aura back, that innate apex predator magnetism had the surrounding passengers parting like the Red Sea, leaving a massive empty space around them. "You take the subway often?" Robert lowered his head. His warm breath brushed right against the shell of Samuel's flushed ear, his deep rumble cutting effortlessly through the deafening roar of the train tracks. "Every day? I ride it every day." Samuel stared fiercely at the swaying handle, desperately trying to ignore the tingling heat at the tip of his ear. At the turnstiles. The hem of Robert's astronomically expensive, custom-tailored shirt was nearly caught by the unforgiving mechanical gates. Instinctively, Samuel reached out and grabbed the man's wrist. The second they touched, a faint jolt of electricity surged straight from Samuel's fingertips to his brain, making him yank his hand back in a flash. "Thank you." Robert turned around, backlit by the station lights. A gentle smile hung on that flawlessly sculpted face, but in the depths of those blue eyes surged a dark spine, chilling tide of obsession. "Can I see you again tomorrow? I'd like to try those convenience store rice balls you mentioned." Over the next few weeks, Samuel's life was violently torn into 2 contradictory realities. One day, the 6'7" aristocrat would be standing in a crowded budget supermarket under harsh fluorescent lights, staring at a packet of discounted instant noodles with an expression of sheer fascination. The very next day, Samuel's notoriously ruthless corporate manager would be offering him a cup of hot tea with trembling hands, his sycophantic smile screaming absolute reverence for the power of the Hohenheim family. Samuel had sat in the suffocatingly spacious back seat of that black luxury sedan, his knuckles turning white as he coldly rejected this condescending charity. Yet, when that unparalleled, untouchable man lowered his profound blue eyes and quietly apologized, Samuel still found himself helplessly agreeing to his dinner invitations. In the massive, almost echoing kitchen of the mansion, Robert would awkwardly grip the handle of a chef's knife, hacking up a plate of tragically mangled greens. It always ended with Samuel having to gently guide his hands, teaching Robert how to chop vegetables and cook dinner, step by step. This surreal intersection of their lives was utterly shattered at 3 a.m. in the 4th week of knowing each other. In the pitch-black bedroom, the harsh glare of the phone screen stung Samuel's eyes. The voice through the receiver wasn't the usual light-hearted tone, punctuated by cute emojis. Instead, it was the ragged, desperate panting of a cornered beast, accompanied by heavy swallowing. "Samuel, help me." Half an hour later, at the base of the ultra-luxury apartment tower, the blinding red and blue lights of emergency vehicles crisscrossed wildly in the night. The humidity of the entire block had reached a sickening, saturated peak. Condensation laid thick on the bulletproof glass doors of the lobby, weeping heavy trails of moisture down the panes. Several caught off guard Omega residents collapsed onto stretchers, their bodies trembling. The veins in their necks stood out starkly, unable to withstand the indiscriminate, crushing weight of the high-tier pheromones. A top-tier Enigma's rut was enough to overwhelm everyone in the vicinity. Pushing past the security guards, Samuel sprinted into the stairwell leading to the 20th floor. The motion sensor lights in the stairwell flickered violently, sizzling as if on the verge of shattering. A visible deep blue aura of absolute domination cascaded down the concrete steps like thick, heavy seawater. With every step upward, Samuel felt his kneecaps grinding, crying out in protest, as if he were plunging into the abyssal depths, bearing the inescapable weight of 10,000 tons of water pressure. Pushing open the half-ajar luxury double doors, the chaotic anomaly inside entirely consumed all reason. Within the sprawling penthouse, priceless vases and ceramics had been reduced to dust under the absolute pressure. The cold moonlight spilling through the floor to ceiling windows was warped into a bottomless, deep sea undercurrent suspended in the air. In the center of the massive bed, the Enigma, who was usually as untouchable and elevated as a deity, was curled up in agony among shredded silk sheets. Robert looked as though he had just been pulled from freezing depths. His long golden hair clung fiercely to his pale cheeks, soaked in sweat. Beneath his icy skin, prominent veins spread like wild vines all the way up his neck. At the sound of the door, his head snapped up, his blue eyes flashing with a primal feral hunger in the dark. "Leave." The man's Adam's apple bobbed in torment, his vocal cords tearing out a fractured, metallic rasp. With his resistance, the warped, deep sea shadows surrounding them suddenly collapsed inward. A materialized, overwhelming aura crashed down like a violent tsunami. Samuel's legs gave out, his knees slamming heavily onto the expensive Persian rug. His alpha instincts screamed a piercing alarm in his mind. Run! This was the absolute domination at the apex of the genetic chain. To stay was to be entirely consumed. But Samuel bit down fiercely on his lower lip until a heavy iron tang flooded his mouth. In the very eye of the storm, he forced himself to stand, dragging his feet step by step toward the bed. He turned around, putting his back to the overwhelmed beast. His long trembling fingers swept aside the sweat, drenched hair at his nape, leaving his vulnerable, scorching, wildly pulsing alpha gland completely defenseless and exposed to those lethal fangs. "Claim me." Samuel heard his own voice shaking, yet it was remarkably clear. "Before I change my mind." Behind him, the mattress let out a heavy groan, sinking under an immense weight. Robert's massive frame was like a colossal shadow, swallowing him whole in an instant. The blistering heat of the beast's ragged breaths fanned across the pale skin of Samuel's nape like wildfire, erupting a shivering trail of goosebumps. Without a single trace of hesitation, sharp canines pierced the delicate skin, sinking inescapably into the deepest core of his gland. Gah! The intense pain sent a shockwave through Samuel, his spine arching sharply as if struck by lightning, his fingers clawing desperately into the sheets beneath him. The warped shadows in the room detonated in that very instant. The furious blue aura manifested into countless tangible chains, surging unapologetically through Samuel's veins. He felt as though he were being pulled inescapably into a pitch-black oceanic trench, suffocating, weightless, every bone in his body groaning and shifting under the terrifying abyssal pressure. Yet, at the very bottom of that breathless abyss, right past the precipice of ultimate pain, an intoxicating addictive sense of symbiosis eerily bloomed. Robert's powerful arms locked around Samuel's waist like bands of iron, embedding the alpha into his blistering chest as if to meld them into one. As their pulses synchronized, the violent deep-sea anomaly gradually ceased its boiling rage. It finally settled into a soft, ethereal blue luminescence, quietly enveloping their intertwined bodies. The man hungrily mapped the mark he had just claimed. His low, gravelly voice pressed intimately against Samuel's unraveling consciousness, whispering into the dark, "Thank you." The blinding morning sun sliced through the heavy blackout curtains like a blade, casting a sharp strip of light across the charcoal, gray velvet bed. Samuel woke up with a violent shudder. His entire skeleton felt as though it had been crushed and reassembled by heavy machinery. The fresh claim at his nape throbbed relentlessly with his pulse, every single cell screaming the reality of last night's soul-shattering marking. The bedroom door was left ajar. The hushed voices carrying from the hallway were piercingly clear. "Clean it up. The press doesn't get a single whisper of this." Robert's tone was ice cold, carrying the unquestionable, ruthless finality of a man at the absolute top. "Young master, he is just a commoner alpha. If your father finds out, shut your mouth." A tangible, deep-sea wave of domination spilled through the crack in the door, warping the shadows on the carpet for a split second. Samuel is not like the rest of them. The moment the door pushed open, the distorted oceanic pressure vanished. Robert stepped into the halo of light, holding a glass of water. He had changed into a bespoke white dress shirt, fully buttoned to the very top in a desperate failing attempt to hide the frantic dark marks on his collarbone, claims Samuel had left during his own overwhelmed frenzy. Unlike the dying beast from last night, he now looked like a flawless freezing marble statue. Only the ashen exhaustion beneath his eyes betrayed the brutal toll the rut had taken on his body. Cool fingertips brushed against the crimson swollen gland at Samuel's nape. Samuel instinctively stiffened his spine, his fingers gripping the edge of the duvet. "I've already requested a leave of absence for you." Robert's voice was remarkably soft, yet his blue eyes locked onto Samuel's pale face with the intensity of a falcon. "I don't need special treatment." Samuel avoided his gaze, his jaw ticking tightly. Robert narrowed his blue eyes slightly, and the air immediately thickened with a suffocating heavy moisture. No alpha is ever willing to be marked by an enigma, not even temporarily. "You saved me last night." An emergency call regarding an acquisition deal cut the confrontation short, and Robert left in a hurry. Standing before the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror, Samuel slipped on Robert's white dress shirt. The astronomically expensive fabric still carried the phantom chill of ocean water. The sleeves hung far past his wrists, empty and loose. The slouched collar brazenly exposed those arrogant Enigma teeth marks, like a permanent tattoo searing absolute ownership into his skin. The man in the mirror looked exactly like a trophy, caged and kept by an apex predator. Over the next 2 weeks, his life was spliced into a surreal silent film. His famously harsh manager began bowing and scraping, and the untouchable CEO would actively stop in the hallways to greet him. Until that Friday. Under the glaring, pale fluorescent lights of the copy room, the printer spit out pages. "Did you hear? The corporate acquisition fell through. All because of that little accountant, Samuel. The Hohenheim family is backing him. The buyer's rep just ran his mouth once, and the next day, the entire deal was nuked." Smack. A heavy binder hit the freezing tile floor. Samuel froze in place, his fingernails biting so deeply into his palms that his knuckles turned a horrifying stark white. That evening, inside the suffocatingly close quarters of the black luxury sedan. "The company acquisition. You intervened?" Samuel glared dead ahead at the windshield, his vocal cords pulled taut to the breaking point. Robert's fingers, which had been tapping on the steering wheel, paused. The light inside the cramped cabin seemed to instantly vacuum away. "I simply didn't want to see you slighted." His voice dropped 8 degrees, dripping with an unquestionable, arrogant finality. "That doesn't matter." Samuel's head snapped around, his eyes blazing with extreme fury and humiliation. Leaning right into the bone, crushing deep sea storm, his hoarse voice trembled violently. "This is my life. I don't need you descending like some kind of savior. The person I have feelings for is you, not the authority of the Hohenheim name." The air went dead silent. The violent dark blue anomaly completely crumbled into dust within seconds. A fierce, seismic shock waved through Robert's profound blue eyes. The iron, wall tension, locked in his neck and shoulders slowly, degree by degree, began to slacken. In the next second, he undid his seatbelt. His massive frame leaned over, pressing in with an absolute undeniable magnetism. The neon city lights outside the window were entirely eclipsed by his broad back, leaving the entire world bathed in nothing but intimate darkness. A gentle, ethereal blue glow replaced the terrifying gravity, floating quietly around them. Robert's large hands cupped Samuel's trembling cheeks, the calloused pads of his thumbs softly tracing the flushed red corners of his eyes. "I'm entirely serious about you, Samuel." He lowered his head, capturing his lips with absolute precision. There was no devouring, no plundering, only the utter, absolute surrender of a man at the top taking down every last one of his defenses. Outside the window, the roaring city traffic blurred into a silent afterthought. In that tight, suffocating space, only that soft blue halo remained, burning quietly, madly in the dark. Monday morning. Samuel walked into the office building, heavy dark circles under his eyes. He had spent the entire weekend agonizing over his relationship with Robert, barely sleeping a wink. Yet, the moment he sat down at his desk, an envelope was waiting for him. The gold foil Hohenheim family crest seared his vision like a branding iron. Inside the pitch, black envelope was a check swimming in zeros, accompanied by a freezing note. Mr. Samuel, thank you for keeping Robert company during this time. The enclosed funds are more than enough to compensate for your time and any other inconveniences. The heir to the Hohenheim family requires a partner of equal standing. I trust you understand my meaning. Hohenheim, under the glaring pale fluorescent lights of the men's room, Samuel's knuckles turned a ghostly white from exertion. The edges of the check, a sum large enough to buy out half his life, were crushed into deep, irreversible creases. On the porcelain sink, his phone vibrated madly, the screen flashing endlessly with Robert's name. Samuel clamped his jaw shut, the line of it pulled as taut as a drawn bow. He lowered his eyelashes, and right before his vision completely blurred, decisively hit the power button. A torrential downpour swallowed the city whole. Inside his dim apartment, Samuel sealed the very last necktie, still carrying the phantom warmth of Robert, into a cardboard box. The doorbell jolted him. The moment he pulled open the heavy security door, the old motion sensor lights in the hallway flickered wildly. The ambient light was instantly warped into a profound dark blue by an invisible, terrifying wave of absolute domination. Robert stood rigidly outside the door. His golden hair was entirely drenched by the storm, freezing droplets crashing down the sharp lines of his brow and high nose bridge. His normally perfectly concealed top-tier aura was completely unspooled. The oxygen in the entryway felt instantly vacuumed away, the atmospheric pressure plummeting. Dense beads of water condensed on the wallpaper at a visible rate, the moisture bizarrely snaking upward in reverse gravity, as if a 10,000-meter abyssal trench had suddenly descended upon them. "Why didn't you answer my calls?" Robert's voice was low, suppressing an incredibly dangerous dark undertow. Samuel turned slightly, avoiding that spine, chilling expanse of dark blue. With trembling fingertips, he held out the crumpled, smoothed-over check. "Return this to its rightful owner for me." Robert's deep blue pupils instantly constricted. The second his eyes caught the signature on the back of the check, the desperate anxiety on his face shattered inch by inch, freezing into a suffocating dead silence. The dark blue shadows swirling around them surged into a furious storm. The air grew so dense that the wooden door frames began to groan and crack under the phantom water pressure. "You're just going to obey?" Robert took a massive step forward. His large hand locked around Samuel's wrist with an inescapable intensity. "You won't even dare to fight back?" "Fight back with what?" Samuel wrenched his hand free, the corners of his eyes instantly stinging with a flush of red. The dim lighting around him suddenly erupted into a parched ashen yellow. His defensive instincts as a common alpha manifested as invisible withered vines and falling ash, desperately holding the line in mid-air against the overwhelming torrential flood of the deep sea. "I don't have some illustrious family name. My savings are barely 20,000. Every time I walk into those high-end restaurants with you, the stares from everyone around us turn me into nothing but an arrogant, pathetic joke." Robert froze in place, his fingertips still loosely curled around the phantom warmth of Samuel's skin. Rainwater dripped from the ends of his hair, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy, hollow thud. The violent, oceanic anomaly surging around them abruptly halted, stagnating into a heartbreaking, sorrowful hue of deep blue. So, because you were afraid, you chose to run. Robert's voice was agonizingly hoarse. It's called waking up. Samuel clenched his fists so tightly that his nails bit into his palms, leaving sharp white crescents in his skin. Then it'll tear down every single obstacle. Robert's voice tore through the air. He closed the distance in a single stride, his hands heavily cupping Samuel's face, forcing him to look up. With his approach, the dark blue shadows were no longer destructive. Instead, laced with a desperate all-or-nothing devotion, they powerfully and inescapably wrapped around Samuel's fading, ashen aura. Robert's calloused thumbs wiped fiercely at the tear spilling from the corner of Samuel's eye. "Samuel, did you really think I would ever let you go?" Robert pressed his forehead firmly against Samuel's, their ragged breaths tangled in the fraction of space between them. "Give me 1 week. If you still want to push me away after 7 days, I promise you, I will vanish completely." Leaving absolutely no room for negotiation, Robert scooped up the heavy cardboard box, turned, and disappeared into the torrential rain. The heavy security door slammed shut. Drained of all his strength, Samuel slid down to the floor, burying his face deep into his trembling hands. For the next 7 days, the dark blue ocean completely receded from Samuel's life. Yet, in the dead of night, he would find himself unconsciously stroking the scent gland at his nape. It still carried the phantom ache of being pierced by an overwhelming deep sea pressure. Late into the night of the 7th day, the cold, blinding fluorescent lights of a discount supermarket made Samuel dizzy. He stood frozen in the instant ramen aisle, his fingertips hovering in mid-air. Need an expert opinion? The moment that deep rumble vibrated against his ear, Samuel whipped his head around. The air beside the shelves rippled invisible gentle water waves, refracting the harsh white light into a kaleidoscope of soft halos. A man in a baseball cap was pushing a shopping cart, his casually tied golden hair catching the light. Dressed in a plain graphic tee and faded jeans, stripped of his bespoke suits and the intimidating halo of his authority, Robert stood there. And yet the untamed magnetism dancing in the depths of his eyes was more vibrantly alive than ever before. "You..." Samuel's pupils trembled slightly. "This entire outfit is under $500. Robert tipped the brim of his cap down and leaned in closer. As he closed the distance, the watery anomaly surrounding them dialed back to an absolute minimum. It was no longer a suffocating ocean, but a warm, humid sea breeze brushing against the cheeks. "This past week, I moved into a run-down apartment on the south side. I squeezed onto the subway. I learned how to haggle at the farmer's market." The curve of Robert's lips carried an undeniable, inescapable magnetism. "My father cut off all my access. Right now, I have absolutely nothing left. Except you. I want to start over. I want to pursue you as an equal." In the dilapidated south side apartment, the cheap paint on the walls was beginning to peel and blister. Yet, as the two of them stood shoulder to shoulder on the tiny, south-facing balcony that barely had enough room to turn around, a brilliant, fiery orange sunset spilled unreservedly from the sky. It coated Robert's sculpted profile in a dazzling golden trim. "What do you think?" Robert leaned against the rusted iron railing. His Adam's apple bobbed slightly, the depths of his eyes brimming with a scorching, raw anticipation. Samuel didn't answer. He took a step forward, his hands violently grabbing the collar of Robert's cheap t-shirt. Tilting his head up, he pulled him down into a fierce, breathless kiss. It was an utterly unreserved kiss, heavy with the desperation of losing everything and finding it again. The air around them instantly boiled over. Under the canopy of the setting sun, the deep, blue oceanic anomaly and the ashen, yellow shadows of withered vines crashed into each other. Then, they inescapably intertwined and fused, shattering into a sky full of brilliant stardust, like fragments that completely swallowed them both. Robert's large hands locked onto the small of Samuel's back, pulling him fiercely against his chest. When they finally broke apart for air, Robert's thumb traced Samuel's swollen, flushed lips. His voice was devastatingly hoarse. "Civilian life isn't all that romantic. The rent goes up, The neighbors are loud. It sounds absolutely perfect. Samuel stared fiercely into his eyes. His tight jawline finally relaxed, breaking into a rare, genuine smile. Especially if you're there too.
And with that, Samuel and Robert's story comes to an end. What do you think the future holds for them? To be completely honest, I wasn't exactly a fan of Robert's arrogance in the beginning. He would intentionally unleash his commanding aura just to toy with Samuel. It made it feel like Samuel was nothing more than a fleeting amusement to him, like a predator playing with a pet. When he crossed the line by interfering with Samuel's career without a word of consent, it genuinely made my blood boil. I completely understand Samuel's fury. After all, Samuel is an alpha. He might be ordinary, but he pulls his own weight. He has his own independence, his own fierce pride. The last thing he wants is someone using their absolute privilege to rewrite his life. Yet, on the flip side, Samuel found himself uncontrollably drawn to Robert's inescapable magnetism. He simply couldn't say no to him, but the massive class divide standing between them served as a brutal, constant reminder that he couldn't afford to fall any deeper. It felt like a doomed romance with no real future. That is, until Robert intervened with his job one more time. That cold, calculated letter was the final straw that broke the camel's back. It pushed Samuel to make the gut-wrenching decision to walk away from Robert's world for good. But thankfully Robert, who started this purely as a game, ended up falling completely and irrevocably in love. He chose to strip away his own power, changing everything for Samuel's sake. So, let's congratulate Samuel on finally finding his true partner in life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.